Masten. So as you join, just write your name, grade, and school and why you registered for this event in the chat, and we'll get started. Okay, I guess we can, as you're doing that, I can provide a brief overview of the club. Nikita, if you could move. Yeah, so as you all know, the Junior Economic Club was founded in 2014, and we're an entirely student-run 501c3 nonprofit. We provide our members with equal opportunity to business exposure, empower the next generation of effective leaders. So we fully fund membership for 150 of Chicago's most ambitious students. And we also have chapters beyond Chicago. I think we have some people joining us today from New York City, Berlin, and elsewhere. So yeah, thanks for joining us today, and I'll hand things over to Nikita.
Hello everyone, my name is Nikita Agrawal and I'm the Assistant Financial Officer of the Junior Economic Club of Chicago. If you have any questions for our speaker during the event, please privately chat them to me and indicate whether you would like to ask the question live or have it asked anonymously. With us today, we have Professor Scott Masten of University of Michigan. Professor Masten joined the University of Michigan faculty in 1984, following 2 years on the economics faculty at the University of Virginia. He held the Louis and Myrtle Moskowitz Research Professorship in Business and Law from 1998 to 99, and was a founding board member and president of the International Society for New Institutional Economics. He is a co-editor of the Journal of Economics and Management Strategy and serves on the editorial boards of the Journal on Law, Economics and Organization, and Managerial and Decisions Economics. Since joining the University of Michigan, Professor Masten has taught the core MBA and BBA applied microeconomics courses, MBA electives on business transactions, and on nonprofit and cooperative enterprise, and a doctoral seminar on the economics of institutions and organization. He has also taught contract design and interpretation, economic analysis of law, and business economics for lawyers in the University of Michigan Law School. Professor Masten chaired the University of Michigan's Faculty, Senate and Senate Advisory Committee on University Affairs, the Senate's Executive Committee from 2014 to 2015. Please join me in welcoming Professor Scott Masten.
All right, well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm always happy for the opportunity to talk about my favorite subject. Let me start off. I'll share screen. I have some slides that we can I will use for this talk, and make sure everything is set up. All right, has the screen shown up?
Yep, we can see everything.
Very good. Oops, I'm just adjusting. I want to be able to see you as well, so I'm just doing a couple of adjustments here. All right. Well, I'm going to start off. I have just a very short video clip that I want to use to get the discussion started. This isn't an endorsement of any products or anything, but we can use this as an example to get it started. So we'll give us a shot.
Great seat.
This is awesome. This is too good. Hello?
I really like your hat.
Thanks.
Can I buy it?
Not for sale.
Name your price.
With Pay a Person from US Bank, pay anyone, anywhere, instantly with just their mobile number.
Deal.
It's just one of the ways the US Bank mobile app lets you take care of business and get on with the game.
I've got this.
All right, so the purpose of that little clip was to illustrate one very basic principle in economics, which is that there are gains from voluntary transactions. So in the video, the woman her view was obstructed by this rather large helmet, and rather than call the police or the stadium operator, she decided to see if she could buy the helmet from the from the other fan, and evidently she valued her view of the game more than he valued the helmet. And so they worked out a deal where she was able to pay him to give up from wearing his wearing that rather oversized helmet. So there's, a basic point there is that there was they were both better off by virtue of being able to strike a deal, and there was some price that was less than she would have been willing to pay, and more than he required to give up his helmet. The second part of that, though, is that there's it illustrates that the existence of a technology that facilitated transacting, right? And so if you suppose that this electronic funds transfer option didn't exist, and you think about how this transaction might have taken place, it might still been the case that she valued her view more than he valued wearing his helmet. But she might not have been carrying enough cash to actually pay him the amount he required to give up the helmet, right? Looks like it's probably an expensive helmet. And she might not have been carrying that kind of cash. So how would this transaction have taken place in that event? Well, she could have said, well, look, I'll send you a check. Give me the helmet now, and I'll mail you a check when I get home, or you can follow me out after the game to an ATM machine and I'll get cash for you then, right? Now he's got sort of a skeptical look on his face right here at this point, and he's sort of saying, well, wait a minute, how do I know once I've given up my helmet, the game is over, that you will actually follow through by sending a check, or that you won't just take off and I never get my money? And so if it hadn't been for the fact that they could make this electronic transaction, this transaction might not have taken place, right? And so what the existence of this technology did was it permitted a transaction that benefited both parties from taking place that might not have had they not had the ability to do that. So let me give you another example along the same lines, right? People who own cars, they don't drive their cars most of the time. Maybe in some careers you might, but it's very relatively most people don't, right? So it's sitting in a garage, and it may be that people have free time, and if they could figure out a way to, they'd be willing to give people rides, right? And there are people out there who need rides, and they'd be happy to pay for a ride if they could link up with people who had cars sitting around and some free time. Right? And the problem is, how do you match up these people who are willing to offer rides with people who from time to time need a ride, right? And so there's now, of course, we almost take it for granted the existence of this technology, which essentially allows those transactions to take place that prior to the existence of Lyft and Uber would have been very hard to cause to occur, right? So riders are better off, drivers are better off, but it's all dependent on the existence of this technology, which allows them to identify each other and to settle on a price. So in both cases, right, what we have is examples of technologies that enable transactions to take place. In this case, by lowering the cost of identifying potential trades, people that are willing to buy and sell, and by facilitating payments, right? In this case, these are electronic innovations that lower the cost of transacting and allow more transactions to take place, right? So what in addition to technology, right, the cost of transacting can also be affected by institutions and by organizational form. So we can affect the cost of transacting not just by these technological factors, but also by how we organize. So just to give some examples of how this might work is that suppose that you fly into a city on business or for vacation, and you need a car temporarily while you're there, right? Now, the way we do this is that we have companies that rent you cars that you can, for a given price, you can use a car for however much time you need, and then you return it. Right now, we take for granted that these are rental car companies, but you could think of another way that the same thing could be accomplished if instead of having rental car companies at airports, what you had were a set of used car markets, right? And so there are people who buy a car when they arrive in the town that they're, or the city that they're visiting. And they own the car and drive it around while they need it. Maybe that's a few days or a week, or it might even be just for the day. And then they go back and they don't need the car anymore, and they sell it to the used car dealer. And that used car dealer then turns around, and next time somebody flies in and needs a car, they sell the car to the next person. Right now, we don't do it that way, right? We rent the cars, but there are some advantages to ownership, right? So people who own things tend to take better care of them than people who rent them. So this is true with apartments and houses, right? People who own their own houses take better care of them than people who rent apartments or houses. So there are some good incentives from ownership, but we don't do that. We rent them. And the reason we don't is because the cost of actually transferring title to cars and negotiating the price of the car when you arrive and when you leave are too high, and it's lower cost to essentially contract for the use of the car rather than go through these series of purchase and sale transactions, right? So this is an example where the organizational form is affecting the cost of transacting, and it's lower cost to transact through rental than through series of ownership transactions. So let me give you one more example along these lines that illustrate this point. All right, so for the airline industry, the efficient way to move both passengers and, say, packages around is through what's called the hub and spoke system. So you could imagine airlines setting up so that they run flights directly to all the different points. So here I only have, what do I have, six locations, right? We have hundreds just in the US, and you add, worldwide flights, and there are many, many more. And it'd be terribly inefficient to run flights between every possible location prior to deregulation in the end of the 1970s. That's essentially how the airline industry was organized. It was the government would approve flights between locations if they thought the demand was high enough. But once the airline industry was deregulated, it quickly moved to a hub and spoke system where, and this is again true for both packages and for passengers, is that it's lower cost to move, let's say, people from one location to a hub, and then to move them from that hub to another location on a different flight, rather than running flights from A to B from every possible combination here. So most of the airline industry is organized in this hub and spoke system. But there's a second question here, is how should that hub and spoke system be governed, right? How do we, what's the relationship among all of these different locations and the flights that serve them, right? So what we typically see, or at least what we imagine we see, is integrated airlines that United or Delta, depending on where you're located, and has the hub location, and they run flights to places in their network. And if they want to move, somebody wants to go from A to C, they sell that person a ticket from A to H, and then from H to C, and they move them along through the system in that fashion, right? So usually we think of this as taking place. These hubs are dominated by large airlines, and then they run this service to the various locations, non-hub airports. So in principle, though, you could imagine organizing this in a different way, right? You could imagine that every route here is served by a separate airline. So there's a AH airline that serves this route, and a BHB airline that serves this route, and they're all separate companies, and that they work out either some sort of a contractual arrangement, or they pay somebody to do the coordination of the flight, so that if you're going from A to C, that this central booking agent tries to schedule things, coordinate, so that there's not too much waiting time in the hub location. And you might think, well, that seems like a complicated way. Why not just integrate? But it turns out that, in fact, that is the way much of the airline industry is organized. So even though we book a flight with United, if you're traveling to a smaller regional airport, it's often the case that that is being served by a flight owned and operated by a private company, right? So there's any flight you're on that says United Express, right? It's very unlikely that that's actually a United flight. These are pilots that work for, depending on where you're going, it might be Mesa Airlines, that is a private company that owns planes and hires pilots and serves, the O'Hare or whatever. And there's a contractual relationship between them. And so, in fact, much of what we think of as an integrated airline is actually a set of contracts. So this is, there are a lot of issues like this. So another, simple example, or one example that illustrates this is that McDonald's, if you go to a McDonald's restaurant, chances are it's a franchise, right? It's owned and operated by an independent contractor who franchises with McDonald's. McDonald's does own and run some of its own outlets, but most of them are franchised out as independent contractors. But if you look at Starbucks, right, they're providing food and drinks. Starbucks owns all its own outlets. They don't franchise at all, right? And so we've got different ways of organizing these transactions. So what we'd like to do is have some, excuse me, understanding of, why do they organize the way they do, and what determines the way they organize. So it's sort of, in more general sense, we can, if you think about the chain of production for any type of product or service, here, let's think about products. We have a manufacturer, and that manufacturer, right, needs supplies. Maybe they assemble something. It might be a car manufacturer or what have you, computer manufacturer. They need to buy supplies, the inputs that go into that manufacturing, or they need to obtain them somehow, right? Those suppliers manufacture things, and so they have suppliers, and those suppliers have suppliers. Eventually, if you go further back up this stream of production, you get to resource producers, the people who are producing the basic materials, and then beyond that, there are resource owners, or people who own the resources, and then they may or maybe not be the ones who are actually producing them. But then you can also move downstream, right? You have manufacturers have to distribute their products, and if they're, they may have retail operations, and then eventually you get to consumers. And so at each one of these nodes, if you will, there's a decision to be made about how do you organize this, right? Does the manufacturer distribute the products itself? Does it have its own retailers, right? So Starbucks owns its own retailers, right? But McDonald's contracts with their retailers, right? And you have the same sort of decisions going upstream as well. So what we have is many of these sort of transactions, potential transactions, and there are lots of different ways of organizing those transactions. Excuse me, one way we might do it is through spot or futures markets, right? So Chicago is home to many of the traditional commodities and various other types of markets. The Chicago Board of Trade and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, right, were locations where a lot of market transactions took place. Most of the things that you and I buy as consumers, we buy as posted or listed prices, right? You go to the grocery store, you look at what the price of bread is, and you decide whether you want to buy it or not, or you look on Amazon and see what the price is, and you decide to purchase it or not from a price that's posted there. There are auctions and competitive bidding. You could negotiate the transactions. In a lot of business transactions, there involve some sort of a contract, and that's true in franchising. And then you have integration, right, where firms may bring production inside, right, and so they will decide not to contract or buy out externally, but will bring production inside. And then we also have government production, right? The government, both not just federal government, but locals and state and local governments also provide goods and services. I work at a state university, right? So that's a kind of government production of higher education there. And governments also regulate various types of economic activity. So what we're concerned with is, at least in this field, is what determines how we do or should organize these big changes of production. And so the first person who really raised this in a systematic way, or at least the transactions cost literature traces back to the work of Ronald Coase, who was a longtime professor at the University of Chicago and a Nobel Prize winner. And way back in 1937, he raised this question about why are there firms at all, right? Why don't we just do all our transactions in markets or through negotiation or through contracts? Markets have lots of desirable features. So why is it that we bring anything? Basically, when you bring things inside the firm, you're creating what in the old days we used to refer to as a sort of little mini Soviet Union, right? Where you have centrally planned economic production, and that's as a general rule we don't like that. And but firms are essentially centrally planned economies, little centrally planned economies. So Coase raised this question: why are there firms? And he said, why is it that a firm will buy some things inside the firm, but then procure them elsewhere from by contract or other means in other cases, and the issues also apply going forward as well. And his answer is because there are transactions costs of using markets, and so he talked a bit about what those transactions costs are. There's we'll spend a lot of time talking about this, but generally speaking, transactions costs are costs of activities that aren't directly productive, but you need to engage in order to conduct exchange, right? They don't produce value in and of themselves, but they're necessary for exchange to take place. And so we could go through a long list of things that are commonly thought of as transactions costs, but just to illustrate this point with one of them, if you think about bargaining, right? If it's a large transaction, there's a lot of money at stake, buying a business or something like that. A lot of time and effort goes into bargaining, right? And bargaining by itself doesn't determine how large the gains from trade are, right? The gains from trade are the difference between the price the buyer's willing to pay and what the seller's willing to accept. All bargaining does is affect the distribution of those gains from trade. And so if they negotiate a higher price, that benefits the seller, lower price benefits the buyer, but it doesn't affect the total gains from trade, which is the sum of the benefits to each of them, right? So it's a cost that is incurred in order for the transaction to take place, but it doesn't increase the value of the transaction jointly when you consider both parties. So if we come back to this question of why should firms vertically integrate, so this is quite often just posed the question: should they make or buy? Should they make their components, or should they buy them from somebody else? And Coase's answer was, as well, that you should bring things inside the firm, internally integrate when the market transactions costs or the costs are greater than the cost of internal organization. But that then just moves us to a set of questions about, what are those costs and what affects the size of those costs, right? So the second big player in this, in the development of transactions cost economics was Oliver Williamson. He was my dissertation advisor. I had some connection with Williamson. So what Williamson did was he took Coase's ideas and he said, well, look, we need to address this question of what is it that determines the size of the transactions cost, right? We sort of recognize that transaction costs are driving these decisions, but when are transactions costs going to affect are going to favor integration versus contracting or some other way of organizing? And so he traced the existence of transactions costs to a couple of human factors, first off, right? So one of them is the concept of bounded rationality, which is just a recognition that people are limited in their knowledge and their ability to make decisions. And so you can't be paying attention to lots of things at one time. It's sort of, there's a scarcity of time and attention that you have, right? And so organizational arrangements that put a lot of demands on your time and attention are going to keep you from looking at other things. It's costly to do that. So he says one of the bounded rationality is one of the important human factors. And the other one is the concept of opportunism, which is a recognition of people's willingness to take advantage of others. So if we go back to the original example of the helmet transaction, right? If there hadn't been for the electronic fund transfer technology, that transaction might not have taken place because the guy with the helmet might not have been willing to trust the woman's promise that she would mail him a check later, right? So he was concerned about that she might be opportunistic. She'd say she was going to pay him later, but once the game is over and she doesn't know, they don't know each other, there's no consequence to her from reneging on her promise to pay. And so the concern here is that you can't always trust people to be honest and to follow through on their promises and to put in their best efforts and so forth. So what Williamson argued was that most organizational problems come down to a trade-off between bounded rationality and opportunism. That the sorts of things that economize on bounded rationality, that reduce the demands on your time and attention, also tend to expose you more to opportunism. So if you're a manager and you can't be running every division in your company, you delegate that authority to somebody else, right? But if you've delegated decision-making authority to somebody else, there's a greater chance that that person will use that authority in a way that isn't beneficial to the company overall, or made, sort of real extreme cases might embezzle money or something, right? And so there's generally going to be a trade-off between the desire to economize on people's time and attention and their exposure to opportunistic behavior. So try to move along here pretty quickly. But what Williamson did was said, okay, well, what are the things then that tend to make either bounded rationality or opportunism more severe problems? And so complexity and uncertainty tend to aggravate bounded rationality problems, right? If you have complex problems or a lot of uncertainty, that means you need to devote more time and attention to those problems. And relationship-specific investments are things that tie two parties together and make it hard for them to discipline the other party by say, terminating the transaction. So don't really have time. If there's an interest, actually, I can provide Nikita and Leo with copies of these slides. You can maybe look at some of these things more detail later. But relationship-specific investments are basically investments that tie the two parties together, and so you're generally going to be more opportunities for opportunism where these investments take place. And so one of my early contributions to this literature was a study of make or buy decisions in a large aerospace procurement. It was actually the production of the Minuteman missile, which I don't think they're made anymore. But aside from being one of the early empirical examinations of this, it's pretty easy to explain what was going on. And so this producer was a General Electric division, had to make decisions of whether to make or buy all the components that went into this missile. And what this diagram essentially says is that when the products were relatively simple, non-complex, and they were relatively standardized, they almost always bought them from external suppliers. So that's less than 1% of the components they would purchase, they would make internally. But if they were both specific to that particular program and they were complex, they were much more likely. So there's 92% chance that they would integrate those components. And so this is a sort of early illustration of how Williamson's ideas played out empirically, and it's one of the most robust. There have been lots of studies in lots of different settings that show the importance, particularly of specific investments in these integration decisions. So what I have here is a sort of a list of some of the areas, and this is a small subset of areas that transactions cost economics has been applied. So make or buy decisions is one of those, right? And looking at contracting practices. One of the places where this is relevant today is in terms of employment versus independent contracting. So you may have read about legislation in California, which seeks to make essentially most if not all gig workers, employees instead of independent contractors. So the status quo is that Uber and Lyft contracted with drivers of cars, and they were independent contractors. And California passed legislation that that essentially would require them to be employees. And then there was a referendum that allowed Uber and Lyft to continue to treat their workers as independent contractors. And then there was last week, I think, a court decision that said no, that the referendum is illegal. And so anyway, this is still being hashed out. But this is a question of, so what difference does it make whether they're employees or independent contractors, right? Why does, what are the implications of hiring them as independent contractors versus employees? And transaction cost economics has things to say about that. Public utility ownership and regulation is another area where this has been applied. And so I have some slides here we won't get to, but one of the things I looked at was the ownership of waterworks in the United States. So most water in the United States is government supplied, right? So you're usually supplied by a municipal waterworks. The town I grew up in New Hampshire, water was supplied by a private company, but nowadays that's pretty unusual. But if you go back to the 19th century, most water companies in the 19th century, most waterworks were privately owned companies. And it wasn't until the 20th century that that really shifted, so that a majority of water was provided by cities, right? And so the question then is, why did that happen? What difference does it make? Why do we see, why did it start out as private and then shift to public supply later on? So there are also applications of this for I know I'm running out of time. I want to leave time for questions for antitrust. And so a lot of antitrust questions turn on organization. And so a study I did that is directly related to antitrust had to do with shoe machinery leasing in the early part of the 20th century. A company called United Shoe Machinery Corporation was sort of the Google or Microsoft, or pick your large dominant company, Amazon of its day. It was a technological leader, but one of the things it did was it leased its machines instead of selling them outright. And the government decided that was anti-competitive and forced United Shoe Machinery Corporation to start selling instead of leasing its machines. And shortly thereafter, United basically, the shoe industry in the U.S. essentially tanked. And so one of the questions is, why did they lease, and what purpose did it serve, and was it really anti-competitive? And again, I'll just quickly. So one issue that I'm working on now is why it is that universities are organized the way they are. So universities are very unusual in the sense that faculty who have essentially lifetime employment because of tenure also have a lot of decision-making authority, right? We get to decide hiring and promotion and curriculum decisions and things like that. It's I don't know of another setting in which employees effectively have as much authority as faculty do, right? So it's a question of why is it that that faculty have this kind of decision authority. I can tell you, having been chair of the faculty senate, it's a very inefficient way of making decisions, but that's the way we have settled on it. And why is that? So I could go on. These are just some examples of applications. It's been applied. The transaction cost framework has been applied quite broadly to questions of organizational and institutional design. I've done some work on merchant courts in medieval Europe, going all the way back to sort of economic history types of things. But I guess the main point I hope to communicate to you is that transaction cost economics is a very useful tool for analyzing questions and understanding how it is we organize the way we do, and in some cases improving on how we do those things. So I will stop there, leave some time for questions, and I thank you very much.
Great. Thank
I
you.
should stop sharing the screen, right? There we go.
Right, so let me just share. So the first question that I have is, how has digitization affected transaction costs?
So it's a good question. It's one that people they've talked. People have talked about how basically the information economy has changed these transaction costs in general. So just the ability to communicate more rapidly and to track packages. Digitization itself has changed. What's the best way to say it's changed some of the problems. I'm trying to think if it's had a separate effect as opposed different from sort of reducing communication costs, but it has altered the nature of some problems. So one of the features of digital products is that they are what economists call I think forgetting the word it's non-rivalrous. They're non-rivalrous goods, right? So what economists mean by this is that if somebody produces a digital good, maybe it's programming or it's music or something like that, the marginal cost of letting another person listen to that song or view that movie or read that ebook is essentially zero, right? There's no, if you sell one more ebook or one more copy of a song, it doesn't reduce the ability of other people to listen to it. There's no opportunity cost, and there's a very, very tiny delivery cost for that digital product. And so what that has complicated in some ways the pricing of goods, right? So from a sort of standard economic perspective, you want to price things at marginal cost. But if marginal cost is zero and you price things at zero, it's hard to make money selling goods if you sell them at a price of zero, right? And so the problem then is how do you make money selling digital goods? This also goes for another good example of this is software, right? So Microsoft, for example, develops an operating system, or Google, has developed or Apple or Google have software that the marginal cost of letting another person use that software is zero, right? And so what a standard economics tells us is that you should price at marginal cost, which means price these things at zero, but you can't make money doing that. So the problem that it introduces is the question of how do you set up pricing schemes that allow companies to make money and still efficiently distribute the products. If you price viewing a movie at a positive price, some people who value viewing the movie at less than whatever that price is, they value it more than the marginal cost of viewing it, because the marginal cost is zero, but with a positive price, they might choose not to watch it, right? And so it's a problem of how do you do this pricing. So there have been various solutions to that, but many of the solutions that companies have come up with, if they're done by large companies like Microsoft or Google, they tend to run afoul of antitrust authorities. So Microsoft had a system for pricing its operating system, where instead of pricing the operating system itself, it charged its prices based on how many machines, how many processors a company sold. So how many machines that Dell or HP sold. And then they were charged with an antitrust violation. They were accused of behaving monopolistically by doing that, when there's a good economic argument to be made that that was a way of solving this problem of how do you make the marginal cost of using this good zero, but still make money. So I think that was probably the main way that digitization has come to play, is that it's complicated pricing decisions and in a way that looks suspicious to antitrust authorities, and so I think that's at least one of the ways in which it's mattered.
Yeah, no, that really explains a lot. I agree that sort of has complicated everything, and it's not just a simple transaction where you go through a broker. But yeah, that kind of leads to my next question, which is how does transaction cost theory affect these big companies such as Apple, Google, or Amazon in antitrust lawsuits?
Okay, yeah. So my answer sort of anticipated, I guess, your next question, which is that it's a lot of the things that Apple, Google, there's been some other big cases involving somewhat, less well-known companies. Their names are slipping my mind right at the moment, but they often involve similar sorts of questions. So the practices that smaller companies do, when smaller companies engage in these practices, the antitrust authorities generally allow them to do it. But it's when these big companies do it that they tend to attract the attention of antitrust authorities. And nowadays, Europe, the EU is much more aggressive. They view these things differently than American antitrust authorities generally have, although that might change with the new administration now. They've got plans to be more aggressive. But Europe has often imposed really large fines on largely American technology companies for things that in the United States we don't consider them to be problems. And so that's led to some suspicion that Europe is just trying to extract funds from large American technology companies. But I don't think that's so much the reason, is they just have they take a different approach to antitrust law, and to sort of some of their economic views are different. But there are definitely transaction cost issues associated with a lot of these things. Bundling is a question where this comes up as well. So companies will, this is, earlier cases, this was, a fairly recent case involving Microsoft in Europe was that Microsoft was fined for including media player in with its operating system, right? So media player being its music app. And so in Europe, they were accused of anti-competitive practices because that disadvantaged other people who wanted to provide apps. Since it came free with your software, they said that excluded other people from charging positive prices for music programs. And so Europe imposed a really large fine on Microsoft for something that in the US wasn't viewed as particularly problematic, but there are definitely implications there.
Yes, thank you. So my next question is, why do movie theaters, for example, penalize those who purchase tickets online by charging a convenience fee?
So I don't know if they're penalizing them, right? So I don't know, the details, the underlying economics. Oftentimes these sort of things are ways of price discriminating, right? So it's the case that there's traditionally, it's been the case at various times that either students or senior citizens would get lower prices for movie tickets than with the general public. And it's not that the theaters wanted to be nice to students and senior citizens. It's that they recognize that students and senior citizens tended to be more price sensitive than the general public was. And so what they wanted to do is they wanted to charge high prices to people who would go to the movies anyway, even if they have a higher price, and then charge low prices to the people who are price sensitive, so they still get those people in, fill in the seats. And so there are lots of, it's a practice of price discrimination is really quite common. And so again, I don't know the underlying details of movie ticket pricing, but one possibility is that movie theaters have recognized that that people who tend to buy tickets online are less price sensitive than people who are willing to stand in line and buy them at the theater. And so this is a way of charging different prices based on how sensitive people are to prices. So airlines do this, right? Airlines charge higher prices to people who are booking travel at the last minute than they do for people who are booking travel 30 days in advance. And they're doing this in part because they realize that people who are booking early are more likely to be discretionary travelers going on vacation, whereas people who are booking last minute are more likely to be business travelers who are less sensitive to price. And so, you see airlines price discriminating in that way as well. That would be my first guess without knowing more about it, but it's an interesting question.
So my next question is, how has transaction cost theory from the 1930s evolved to fit the modern world today?
Yeah, so there wasn't, with the exception of Coase's work, 1937, there really wasn't much in the way of transactions cost theory. In fact, there wasn't much in the way of transaction cost theory from until sort of the mid 1970s. So you'd hear people referring to transactions costs, and Coase's most famous paper, which was published in 1960, The Problem of Social Cost, was dealing with the issue of externalities and how to think about externalities and how government should respond to externalities. So his example was railroads that kicked off sparks and set farmers' fields on fire, right? And there's externality from the train traffic, and who should be responsible for the damage caused by sparks from these trains. And there are often references to transactions cost theory, sort of, more starting with Coase in 1960 rather than in the 30s. And the problem is that Coase's, although I think his insight was absolutely fundamental, there hadn't been much in the way of effort to make it into a predictive theory. So there was this tendency to say, well, why do we observe cities providing water instead of having private companies, while we have electric utilities are private companies, right? And so why is water provided by cities and electricity provided by private companies? And the tendency was to say, well, it must be because the transactions cost of providing water in the market are higher than it is for electricity, right? Well, that might be true, but how do you, that's, that was the argument was said to be tautological, right? You just say, well, whenever we see something, it must be because the transaction costs of doing it other ways are higher. And so to make the theory predictive and to make it really useful, you needed to be able to relate transactions costs to both the nature of the organizational forms, but also to attributes of the transaction in a way you could develop hypotheses that could be tested. And that's sort of where Williamson's work, beginning in the 1970s, came into play. He was the first one to sort of take Coase's insights and develop it to a way that allowed people to do empirical work and to actually make predictions and test them. So I'd say that's probably the biggest development, over that period. And there've been, people continue to make both theoretical and empirical contributions since then. Since the 70s into the 80s, it's just been extended. It started off by looking at the question of vertical integration in the firm, but it's been expanded now to cover just any number of different topics. If it involves institutions or organizations in some way, there are transaction cost economists who have looked at it. So I don't know if is that getting to does that answer to your question?
Yes, thank you. So the next question is, what advice do you have for high school students interested in economics?
So if your interest is in economics and you're thinking of it as sort of a career, so that you're going to do more than just sort of major in economics in college, and you actually plan on using economics professionally beyond that, for better or worse, my advice is to take as much math as you can. For better or worse, it has become the case that to get through, say, an economics graduate program, you need to be able to, you need to be good at math. You need to be able to know the mathematical tools. And once you get through that hurdle of graduate school, you can often relax the amount of math you use, although it's still, it's still important. And a lot of people complain that the economics has become too mathematical, that people like Coase, who used very little, no math usually, I guess. He would have had a hard time in the modern era of economics. So again, it's just as a practical matter, it's just really important to take math, as much as you can. It's important getting into these programs, and it's important to actually getting through them. But if you're not going professionally, it's still probably in most, even as economics majors, use the microeconomics course, there's still going to be a fair amount of math. You don't need to know as much as you do for graduate school. But for majors, again, you still need to have at least, at a minimum through, calculus sort of courses, but the more, I guess, probably the easier it will be, on you.
Yeah, thank you. So now we'll have some questions from our members. As a reminder, please privately chat them to me and indicate whether you would like to ask the question live or have it asked anonymously. So our first question is, how is transaction cost calculated?
So is that, I guess it's hard to ask for clarification, but maybe think of how they're measured as opposed to calculated. So there's we didn't have time to get into the issue of what transaction costs actually are. It's an issue that there's no sort of universally accepted definition of transactions cost, right? So that we can't even agree on necessarily what is a transactions cost versus a production cost all the time. But beyond that, there are attempts to measure transactions costs, to say how large are they, and so I'll refer back to one of my early attempts to try to do that. We did it in a study of shipbuilding. And so ships have and these happen to be naval vessels, so they had weapons and guidance systems in addition to all the other things that ships require, propulsion systems and so forth. And so it's a large, complicated project to build a naval ship. And so some of the things that the company would make itself. They'd hire employees and have equipment to produce, and others it would buy from outside. And we looked at this decision of what affected that make or buy decision for shipbuilding. But something that was novel in this particular study is that we tried to measure transactions costs as well, to say, can we say how much of the cost of building a ship is transactions costs versus other production costs? And so we used some statistical techniques and some data we got from the company to attempt an estimate at the size of these costs. So roughly speaking, our estimates were that about, I think it was like 14–15% of the cost of a ship went to transactions costs, but that was if they organized efficiently. If they produce something internally that they should have subcontracted, that raised transactions costs by a lot, or vice versa, if they subcontracted something they should have produced internally, that also raised the transaction costs by a lot. So it looked like there were some significant implications of organizing incorrectly, which is what we really were sort of interested in, was how important is it to choose the organizational form correctly? It varied with the nature of the components, so it's hard to make general statements. But what we found is that there was, the consequences of mistaken organization were quite large. That there was a penalty for choosing the wrong organizational form. But it's a difficult question to give you a simple answer to, I guess.
Thank you. So our last question will be from Callie.
Hi, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. I was wondering, I have a more personal question about how did you know you wanted to pursue economics and specifically transaction cost economics?
Well, thanks, Callie. That's my daughter's name, by the way. Callie.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah. So, well, how much time do we have? When I was in high school, I thought I wanted to be a lawyer. My favorite subject was history. I got to college, and I decided to take some economics classes, partly because I had been good at math in high school, and in economics, I figured do some math there, and it seemed like an interesting thing to do. There were some intervening steps. The first Arab oil embargo occurred my freshman year in college, and oil prices shot up by a factor of 3 basically overnight. And we would get into these large dorm room and discussions about whether we were about to run out of oil and the end of the world was coming and things like this. And I found that my introductory economics classes were real useful in those debates. But the thing that really changed me to decide I still wanted to be a lawyer, and the thing that really convinced me to go into economics was that I took an elective called Economic Analysis of Law, and I spent a winter up in the 9th level of the library stacks reading law cases when all my friends were out skiing. And I decided that maybe I didn't want to be a lawyer after all, spending all this time reading these boring cases. But I at that point realized that I could still have an interest in law and pursue legal questions, but do that as an economist, right? So this economic analysis of law said, well, I can analyze laws without having to read all these boring cases. So it was at that point where I really switched to deciding that I wanted to be an economist. Didn't think much about what I was going to do with an economics degree, but I went to graduate school, and it's the main reason to be a professional academic economist is that you want to be able to pursue questions that you're interested in, that you want to you're curious and like to be able to choose your own topics, and as things progressed, you sort of settle on a field and a set of topics, and these organizational issues that always aligned with my interests. So part of what I do is called sort of organizational economics, but it's also law and economics. So study of contracting and legal rules and things like that. And so you can continue to pursue those kinds of questions in that setting. So that's sort of in brief what set me off to decide to be an economist. Thank you, Callie, for the question.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for your time and attention. Your scarce attention. I found a rationality.